A dog refused to leave a mountain man's baby alone. Minutes later, he burst into tears. At first light, in a frozen cabin high in the mountains, a rugged loner wakes to the sound of furious scratching. Dust shakes from the log walls as his old trail dog digs and barks at the cradle like the devil himself is inside. Annoyed, he stomps over, and then the church bell in his mind seems to stop. The baby isn't moving. Her lips are turning blue. And that dog, that stubborn, desperate dog, won't let him look away. But just when he thinks disaster has passed, someone in town wants the dog gone, and whispers say it ain't just jealousy. It's fear. Fear of what the dog knows. Fear of what the dog saw. Fear of secrets buried deeper than any winter snow. Why was the dog so determined to stay by that cradle? And when danger rides up the trail again, will the truth that dog uncovered be enough to save the child, or tear the frontier wide open? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The mountain air bit sharp and cruel through the cabin's wooden walls as the last embers of the evening fire faded to dull orange specks. Michael Hale stirred beneath his wool blanket, his body instinctively curling against the pre-dawn chill. The darkness pressed heavy around him, broken only by those dying coals that cast weak shadows across the rough-hewn floor. A violent scratching sound cut through the silence. Michael's eyes flew open, his heart jumping at the sudden noise. Lulu, his faithful trail dog, was pawing frantically at Rose's cradle, her nails scraping against the wood with desperate intensity. Her usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by an urgency that made Michael's skin prickle. "Hush now, girl," he muttered, voice thick with sleep. But Lulu wouldn't hush. Instead, she let out a series of sharp, piercing barks that echoed off the cabin walls. The sound was unlike anything he'd heard from her before, raw and frightened. Michael threw off his blanket, wincing as his feet hit the cold floor. "Lulu, that's enough!" His annoyance grew with each step toward the cradle. The dog had never acted this way before, not in all the months since Rose was born. As he approached, Lulu's barking grew more frantic, her body trembling with tension. He reached down to push her aside, his hands meeting her warm fur. "What's gotten into you, girl? You'll wake the baby." The words died in his throat as he looked down into the cradle. The weak light from the embers was enough, more than enough, to show him what was wrong. Rose lay still, too still, her tiny lips tinged an awful shade of blue. Her chest, which should have been rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep, was frightening in its stillness. "No," Michael breathed, the word barely a whisper, then louder, raw with terror. "No." His hands shook as he lifted Rose from her cradle. She was limp in his arms, her skin cool to the touch. The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet as panic clawed at his chest. He couldn't lose her. Not Rose. Not like this. Through the fog of fear, a memory surfaced. The traveling doctor who'd passed through last fall, sharing wisdom over coffee at Michael's fire. The man had shown him what to do if a baby stopped breathing, demonstrating on his medical bag. Michael had paid attention, but never thought he'd need to use that knowledge. Now it was all he had. He knelt by the dying fire, laying Rose gently on his thickest wool shirt spread across the floor. The embers cast just enough light to work by. His fingers, usually so steady with a rifle or axe, trembled as he positioned them on her tiny chest. "Please," he whispered, beginning the careful compressions. "Please, Lord, not her too." The doctor had been specific about the pressure. Gentle, so gentle with one so small. Michael counted under his breath, trying to keep time as he'd been shown. After each set, he leaned down, covering Rose's mouth and nose with his own lips, giving her the smallest puffs of air he could manage. Seconds stretched into minutes. Sweat beaded on Michael's forehead despite the cold. Lulu paced nearby, whining softly, her nails clicking against the floor. Michael's arms ached, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The alternative was unthinkable. "Breathe, baby girl," he pleaded between compressions. "Please breathe for Papa." The memory of his wife's death threatened to overwhelm him, the same helplessness, the same crushing fear. But he pushed it away. Rose needed him now. He couldn't fail her too. Just when despair began to creep in, Rose's body jerked. A sharp gasp broke the silence, followed by a weak cry that was the sweetest sound Michael had ever heard. Color flooded back into her face, the terrible blue tinge fading from her lips. Michael gathered her close, his whole body shaking with relief. Tears he hadn't realized he was crying fell into Lulu's fur as the old dog pressed against him, her tail wagging slowly. He buried his face in her warm neck, words spilling out between ragged breaths. "Thank you, girl. Thank you. Without you—" He couldn't finish the thought. Didn't need to. Lulu had saved Rose's life as surely as if she'd pulled her from a river. The dog's instincts had warned him in time, when he might have slept on, unaware, until it was too late. Rose's cries grew stronger, and Michael rose on shaky legs. The fire needed tending first. He couldn't risk letting the cold take hold again. Keeping Rose cradled in one arm, he used his free hand to add kindling to the embers, carefully nursing them back to life. Small flames began to lick at the dry wood, casting a warmer glow through the cabin. He wrapped Rose in her warmest blankets, layering them carefully around her tiny form. Her breathing had steadied, but fear still gripped his heart. This wasn't the first time she'd had trouble breathing, though it was by far the worst. The spells seemed to be getting more frequent, and he knew with bone-deep certainty that he couldn't handle another night like this alone. As he paced the cabin floor, holding Rose close and watching the darkness slowly give way to dawn, Michael made his decision. As soon as there was enough light to ride safely, he would bundle Rose up and take her into town to see the doctor. The journey would be hard on her, but staying here, isolated on the mountain, was no longer an option, not when her very breath could stop in the night. Lulu watched him from her place by the fire, her brown eyes reflecting the growing flames. Michael paused in his pacing to scratch behind her ears, his throat tight with gratitude. "You're coming with us, girl," he said softly. "Don't reckon I'll ever leave you behind again, not after tonight." The dog's tail thumped against the floor in response, and Michael felt the first faint warmth of hope pierce through his fear. The sun wasn't up yet, but its promise painted the eastern sky beyond the cabin's small window. He had survived the longest night of his life, thanks to Lulu's vigilance and whatever grace had guided his hands in those desperate moments. As he waited for full daylight, Michael held his daughter close, counting each precious breath. The fire crackled steadily now, pushing back the mountain cold, while Lulu kept her watchful post nearby. Together they waited for dawn and the chance to seek the help they so desperately needed. Through the window, the sky continued to lighten, promising a clear day for their journey. Michael knew the path to town would be treacherous this early in the morning, with frost still coating the narrow mountain trails, but he had no choice. Rose's life depended on making that ride, on finding help before another night fell. The morning sun painted golden fingers through the pine branches as Michael secured the last strap on his saddle. His movements were quick but careful, each motion planned to avoid jostling Rose, who was bound tightly to his chest in a makeshift sling. The fabric, torn from his softest shirt, held her close enough that he could feel each shallow breath against his heart. Frost sparkled on the cabin's rough-hewn logs behind him, beautiful but deadly in its warning of the bitter cold that had nearly claimed his daughter's life. His horse, Shadow, stamped restlessly, breath streaming in the crisp mountain air. The gelding seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. "Easy now," Michael murmured, running a calming hand down Shadow's neck. The horse's coat was thick with winter fur, ready for the challenging ride ahead. Lulu circled their legs, her nose to the ground, but her attention never straying far from Rose. Michael double-checked his saddlebags. Blankets, spare cloths, the last of yesterday's bread. His rifle was secured in its scabbard, though he hoped they wouldn't need it. The trail to town wasn't known for bandits, but a man traveling with an infant couldn't be too careful. "Time to go, girl," he called to Lulu. The dog's ears perked up, and she took her place beside Shadow, ready to lead the way. Michael swung carefully into the saddle, one hand steadying Rose against his chest. Her weight was so slight, yet she seemed to anchor him to the earth itself. The trail descended sharply from his cabin, switching back through stands of aspen and pine. Overnight, frost had left the path treacherous. Patches of ice glinted between rocks, and frozen mud threatened to turn an unwary hoof. Michael let Shadow pick his way carefully, trusting the horse's sure-footedness more than his own judgment. "That's right, nice and slow," he spoke, as much to himself as to Shadow. Rose stirred against him, making a soft sound of protest. "Shh, baby girl, we're getting you help." His voice caught on the words as memories of the night's terror washed over him again. Lulu ranged ahead, her gray-flecked muzzle testing the air, then circled back to check on them. The morning warmed gradually as they descended, but Michael kept Rose bundled tight. He wouldn't risk her catching a chill, not after what they'd been through. The usual 2-hour ride stretched longer as they picked their careful way down the mountain. Michael's back ached from maintaining his rigid posture, trying to shelter Rose from every jolt and bump. He spoke to her constantly, a quiet stream of reassurance. "Look there, Rose. See those bluebirds? They're coming back early this year, and over yonder the aspens are thinking about their spring leaves. You'll love watching them dance in the wind when you're bigger." His words covered his growing anxiety as they finally approached the settlement. Miller Creek wasn't much, a scatter of wooden buildings straddling the creek that powered the sawmill, but it had what they needed most: Dr. Henry Cabot's clinic. The settlement stirred with late morning activity as Michael guided Shadow down the rutted main street. Women hung washing in the pale sunshine, children chased each other between buildings, and the smithy's hammer rang out its steady rhythm. The normality of it all felt strange after his night of terror. The clinic sat at the far end of town, a weathered 2-story building with a deep porch. As Michael drew closer, he noticed a woman he didn't recognize sweeping the wooden boards. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, her broom pausing mid-stroke. Michael's hands shook as he drew Shadow to a halt. The morning's hard ride and lack of sleep were catching up with him, making even simple movements difficult. Rose's breathing seemed more labored, or was that just his fear speaking? The woman on the porch set aside her broom and stepped forward, her eyes sharp with concern. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her late 20s, with dark hair neatly pinned back and practical frontier clothing that spoke of recent arrival. Too new to have acquired the worn look of veteran settlers. "You look like you could use some help," she said, her voice steady and kind. She moved closer, taking in his exhausted face and the precious bundle against his chest. "I'm Stella Ellison. Let me hold her while you dismount." Michael hesitated. He hadn't let anyone but Dr. Cabot hold Rose since her mother. But Rose chose that moment to let out a weak cry, and his arms were trembling with fatigue. He needed help, whether he liked it or not. "Much obliged, ma'am," he managed, carefully unwinding the sling. Stella stepped up beside Shadow, her arms reaching up with confident gentleness. The way she positioned her hands showed she'd held infants before. "There we go, little one," she murmured as she took Rose. "Your papa's right here, don't you fret." Her sure tone helped steady Michael's nerves as he slid from the saddle, his legs stiff from the long ride. Lulu positioned herself between Stella and the street, watching the stranger holding her charge. But something in Stella's manner must have satisfied the old dog, because her tail gave a cautious wag. "The doctor's inside," Stella said, already moving towards the clinic door. "He's just finished with his morning patients." She cradled Rose with one arm, while opening the door with practiced ease. "Dr. Cabot, we need you." The clinic's interior was warm and smelled of herbs and pine soap. Dr. Henry Cabot emerged from his back room, wiping his hands on a clean cloth. He was a solid man in his mid-40s, with kind eyes and a careful way of moving that inspired confidence. "Michael Hale," he said, taking in the situation at a glance. "What brings you down the mountain so early?" Michael described the night's events in a rush of words, his voice cracking when he reached the part about finding Rose not breathing. Stella's soft gasp told him she understood the gravity of what had happened, while Dr. Cabot's face grew serious. "Bring her here," the doctor directed, gesturing to his examination table. He'd already spread a clean blanket across the worn wood. Stella laid Rose down with infinite care, staying close as the doctor began his examination. Michael watched, his heart in his throat, as Dr. Cabot listened to Rose's chest and checked her color. Lulu settled at Michael's boots, her warm presence anchoring him as the doctor worked. The silence stretched, broken only by Rose's occasional whimper and the doctor's quiet humming. Finally, Dr. Cabot straightened up. "She's stable now, but her breathing is indeed fragile. I've seen similar cases. Some babies just have a harder time of it, especially in the mountain air." He began gathering supplies from his shelves as he spoke. "You'll need to keep her away from smoke. No more sleeping by the fire. And cold drafts are dangerous. Any stress on her lungs could trigger another spell." Michael's mind raced. No fire meant a cold cabin, but cold air was just as dangerous. How could he possibly? "There are things you can do," Stella spoke up, as if reading his thoughts. She had one hand resting lightly on Rose's blanket, her touch seeming to soothe the baby. Warming stones wrapped in cloth, tight-sealed windows. "My husband and I—" She paused, something flickering in her eyes before she continued. "We managed similar challenges at our homestead back east." "The widow Ellison knows what she's talking about," Dr. Cabot added, measuring herbs into a small paper packet. "She's been helping me organize the clinic since she arrived last week. These herbs will help when Rose's breathing gets labored. Mix them with honey and let it dissolve on her tongue." "But Michael," he fixed him with a serious look, "you need to understand. This isn't something that will just pass. She'll need constant watching, especially through the winter months." Michael nodded, feeling the weight of it settle on his shoulders. But at least now he had something to fight, instead of just his helpless fear. "I understand, Doctor. Whatever it takes." "I'll write down the instructions," Stella offered, moving to the doctor's desk. Her handwriting was clear and precise as she noted down everything the doctor had said, adding her own suggestions about warming stones and sealing drafts. Rose began to fuss, and Michael moved to lift her. His hands were steadier now, but exhaustion made him clumsy. Stella stepped in smoothly, helping him settle Rose back into the sling. "Thank you," Michael said, realizing he hadn't properly acknowledged her help. Both of you. I don't know what I would have— That's what neighbors are for, Dr. Cabot said firmly. Though you're hardly neighboring, up there alone on that mountain. There was gentle reproof in his tone. Michael accepted the doctor's packet of herbs and Stella's carefully written instructions, tucking them safely away. The morning's terror had eased, replaced by determination. He would do whatever was needed to keep Rose safe, no matter the cost. Stepping out onto the porch, Michael squinted in the bright sunlight. Behind him, he heard Stella speaking quietly with the doctor, something about helping organize his medical texts. He paused, looking back through the doorway. Stella glanced up, meeting his gaze. There was something in her eyes, understanding, concern, and something else he couldn't quite name. For the first time since Rose's mother died, he felt a flicker of connection with another person. It startled him, this sudden awareness of something beyond his grief and worry. The moment held, then broke as Rose stirred against his chest. Michael touched the brim of his hat in awkward thanks and turned toward where Shadow waited patiently. Lulu trotted down the steps ahead of him, ready for the journey home. But as he prepared to mount up, Michael found himself acutely aware of Stella's presence, still watching from the clinic door, her quiet strength somehow reassuring in the face of all he had to do. Michael settled onto the clinic's front bench, cradling Rose while she dozed. The morning's terror had left him drained, but he couldn't bring himself to head home just yet. Not until he was certain Rose's breathing would hold steady. Lulu lay at his feet, her chin resting on her paws but her eyes alert, watching every passerby with careful attention. The clinic door opened, and Stella Ellison stepped out carrying a cup of steaming tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering it to him. "It's been quite a morning." "Thank you, ma'am." Michael shifted Rose gently to free one hand for the cup. The tea was strong and sweet, exactly what he needed. Stella settled onto the far end of the bench, smoothing her skirts. "I should properly introduce myself," she said. "As I mentioned, I'm Stella Ellison. I arrived last week from back east, and I'm hoping to secure the school teacher position here." She gestured toward the weather-worn schoolhouse down the street. "The previous teacher left rather suddenly, I'm told." Michael nodded. He'd heard about Miss Peterson's hasty departure after her fiancé struck gold in California. "The children could use some learning," he said. "Town's been growing fast with the railroad coming." At the mention of the railroad, something flickered across Stella's face. Concern, perhaps, or worry. But before Michael could puzzle it out, the thunder of hooves drew their attention to the street. A rider approached on a sleek bay horse, his clothes citified and expensive despite the dust of travel. He sat tall in the saddle, surveying the town like a man accustomed to owning whatever he saw. As he drew closer, Michael noticed his cold eyes and the careful way he studied each building, each face. The stranger's gaze fell on Stella, and his expression tightened with recognition. Something hard and calculating entered his features as he reined his horse to a stop before the clinic. "Mrs. Ellison," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge. "I thought I might find you here." Stella's spine straightened. "Mr. Rudd," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I didn't expect to see you so soon." "The railroad's business waits for no one." Silas Rudd swung down from his saddle, his boots striking the dirt with purpose. He started toward the clinic steps, but Lulu rose to her feet, a low growl rumbling in her chest. Rudd's lip curled. "That animal seems dangerous," he said, his hand dropping to rest meaningfully on his hip. "Town council won't take kindly to loose dogs interfering with legitimate business." Michael stood slowly, keeping Rose secure against his chest. Without a word, he positioned himself between Rudd and both Stella and Lulu. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His stance said everything about where he stood. Rudd's eyes narrowed, measuring the situation. After a moment, he stepped back, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "We're all civilized people here," he said. "No need for protective displays. I simply wanted to remind Mrs. Ellison that the railroad operates on strict schedules. We don't appreciate delays in our arrangements." "I've made my position clear, Mr. Rudd," Stella said, her voice steady despite the tension Michael could see in her shoulders. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to." She stood and gave Michael a quick nod before hurrying inside the clinic. Rudd watched her go, then turned back to Michael. "You'd do well to mind your own business, Mr. Hale," Michael supplied, not moving from his protective stance. "Michael Hale." "Ah, yes, the mountain man." Rudd's tone dripped with dismissal. "Well, Mr. Hale, a word of friendly advice. This town is changing. The railroad brings progress, and progress doesn't look kindly on those who stand in its way." His gaze flickered to Rose, then back to Michael's face. "Especially those with responsibilities." Before Michael could respond, Rudd turned and walked away, following the direction Stella had taken. He didn't approach her directly, but his voice carried clearly as she emerged from the clinic's side door. "The railroad doesn't forgive delays, Mrs. Ellison. Remember that." Michael watched as Stella hurried away, her steps quick but dignified. Rudd mounted his horse and rode towards the telegraph office, satisfaction evident in the set of his shoulders. The sun had begun its westward slide by the time Michael finished his business in town. He'd purchased supplies, had Rose checked one final time by Dr. Cabot, and gathered everything he'd need to make his cabin safer for her. But as he prepared to mount up, he spotted Stella standing near the boarding house, her face troubled as she glanced repeatedly toward the telegraph office where Rudd had disappeared. Something in her hesitation struck him. She was alone here, new to town, already facing threats from men like Rudd. Before he could think better of it, Michael led Shadow over to where she stood. "Mrs. Ellison," he said quietly, "if you need a ride to your lodgings." Relief flickered across her face, quickly replaced by polite hesitation. "I wouldn't want to trouble you, Mr. Hale. You have your daughter to think of." "No trouble," he assured her. "Shadow's strong enough for 3, and it's getting late." He didn't mention Rudd, didn't have to. They both understood the unspoken reason for his offer. After a moment's consideration, Stella nodded. "Thank you. I'm staying at the Miller place just past the creek." Michael helped her mount behind the saddle, then swung up himself, keeping Rose secure in her sling. Lulu trotted alongside as they rode out of town, her ears swiveling to catch every sound. They traveled in comfortable silence, the only sounds being Shadow's steady hoofbeats and the evening birds beginning their songs. At the Miller's farm, Michael helped Stella down, careful to maintain proper distance and decorum. "Thank you, Mr. Hale," she said, straightening her skirts, "for everything today." Michael touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." As he turned Shadow toward home, his mind churned with the day's events. Rose's breathing crisis had been frightening enough, but now there was this business with Rudd. The railroad agent's threats had been clear, and something in the man's cold eyes said he wouldn't hesitate to act on them. The setting sun painted the mountains in shades of purple and gold as Michael, Rose, and Lulu began their climb home. Rose slept peacefully against his chest, her breathing steady for now. But Michael couldn't shake his unease about Silas Rudd's arrival in town and what it might mean for all of them. Lulu padded alongside, her watchful presence a comfort, as always. But even she seemed unsettled, occasionally looking back toward town with her ears pricked forward. Whatever was coming, Michael had a feeling their quiet life on the mountain was about to change. The trail wound higher, taking them away from the town's growing troubles and back to their solitary cabin. But for the first time in months, Michael found himself thinking beyond his own small world of grief and survival. Stella's situation nagged at him, and Rudd's threats hung in the air like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He had enough troubles of his own: a sickly daughter, a remote cabin to maintain, the daily challenge of survival in the high country. And yet he couldn't deny the pull of connection he'd felt today, or the instinct to protect that had risen so naturally when Rudd appeared. Shadow picked her way carefully along the frost-hardened trail as the first stars began to appear above the mountain peaks. Michael adjusted Rose's blankets, checked her breathing for the 100th time, and tried to focus on the immediate challenges ahead. He had a cabin to prepare, drafts to seal, a daughter to keep alive through the coming winter. But even as he concentrated on these practical matters, his thoughts kept returning to the quiet strength in Stella's voice and the barely hidden fear in her eyes when Rudd had appeared. Something was wrong there, something that went beyond simple railroad business. And despite his best intentions to stay uninvolved, Michael had a feeling he was already caught up in whatever was coming. The sun had disappeared behind the mountains by the time Michael reached his cabin. Rose slept soundly against his chest, her tiny breaths steady and warm. He dismounted carefully, leading Shadow to the barn, while Lulu trotted ahead to check the cabin's perimeter, a habit she'd developed since Rose was born. Inside the cabin, Michael laid Rose in her cradle and stoked the banked fire back to life. The events of the day weighed heavy on his mind as he moved through his evening routine. Silas Rudd's threatening behavior toward Stella kept surfacing in his thoughts, along with the cold calculation in the railroad agent's eyes. Michael had seen that look before, in men who valued profit over people. The way Rudd had watched Rose, using her as a veiled threat, made Michael's jaw clench. He checked the cabin's windows and door, making sure everything was secure before settling into his chair by the fire. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by Rose's occasional whimpers and his own troubled dreams. When dawn finally broke, Michael rose early to tackle his chores. He split wood until the pile beside the cabin grew substantial, fed and watered Shadow, and made sure the cabin was warm before preparing for another trip to town. "Keep watch, girl," he told Lulu, who sat attentively by Rose's cradle. The dog's brown eyes met his, full of understanding. She wouldn't leave Rose's side until they returned. The morning air was crisp as Michael rode toward town, Rose secured against him. He told himself he was just checking on supplies, but Stella's situation nagged at him. Something about Rudd's threats felt immediate, dangerous. The town was already bustling when they arrived. Michael tied Shadow outside the general store and headed inside, nodding to familiar faces. As he gathered supplies, he overheard whispered conversations about railroad surveys and land disputes. Rudd's influence was spreading like frost across a window pane. He found Stella at the schoolhouse, organizing books on worn wooden shelves. She turned at his footsteps, her face brightening with recognition. "Mr. Hale," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "How is Rose this morning?" "Better," Michael replied, shifting the baby in his arms. "The doctor's advice helped." He paused, searching for words. "Mrs. Ellison, about yesterday." Stella's smile faded. She glanced towards the window, then moved closer, speaking softly. "Mr. Hale, I feel I owe you an explanation." She pulled a folded document from her pocket, hands trembling slightly. "My husband, before he passed, left me the deed to land just north of town. Land the railroad needs for their new line." Michael studied her face. "And Rudd wants it." Yes. Stella's voice strengthened with determination. Thomas, my husband, he knew something about the railroad's plans, something that worried him. He made me promise to keep the deed safe, no matter what. Before Michael could respond, a shadow fell across the schoolhouse door. Silas Rudd stood there, his presence filling the small space with tension. How touching, Rudd drawled, stepping inside. The widow and the mountain man, sharing secrets. His gaze fixed on the paper in Stella's hands. Though I feel obligated to warn you, Mr. Hale, about associating with someone holding fraudulent documents. The deed is legal, Stella said firmly, registered and witnessed. Mistakes happen, Rudd replied, his voice carrying to the small crowd gathering outside. Especially with hasty paperwork filed by dying men. The railroad has proof of prior claim to that land. He turned to address the onlookers. And I remind everyone that interfering with railroad business carries serious consequences. His eyes found Michael again. As does harboring dangerous animals. That dog of yours already caused trouble at the clinic. One more incident, and the town council will have to take action. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Rudd tipped his hat with mock politeness and strode out, leaving whispers and uneasy glances in his wake. Michael watched the townspeople disperse, noting how they avoided Stella's eyes. He's trying to turn the town against me, Stella said quietly. The Millers told me this morning they can't extend my stay. No one will rent to me now, not with Rudd watching. Michael looked down at Rose, remembering his own desperate times after his wife's death. The thought of offering shelter to a woman, especially a widow, brought back painful memories of Sarah. But he couldn't leave Stella to Rudd's mercy. My cabin, he said finally, the words coming slowly. It's rough, but there's space, until you can make other arrangements. Stella's eyes widened. Mr. Hale, I couldn't impose. It's not imposing if you help with chores, he said quickly. Rose needs watching when I'm working, and winter's coming. He nodded toward the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. You can't be without shelter when the snow hits. Stella studied him for a long moment, weighing pride against practicality. I accept, she said finally. Thank you. I'll earn my keep, I promise. They gathered her few belongings from the miller's farm, books, clothes, a small trunk of household items. Michael helped her mount behind him on Shadow, the trunk secured to the saddle. As they rode out of town, he felt Rudd watching from the telegraph office window. The trail home seemed longer with Stella behind him, her presence both foreign and oddly comforting. Rose slept peacefully in her sling, undisturbed by the gentle motion of Shadow's gait. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Michael spotted the first snowflakes drifting down through the pine boughs. Lulu met them at the cabin door, tail wagging as she recognized Stella. The dog's acceptance eased something in Michael's chest. Lulu had always been a good judge of character. It's not much, he said as he helped Stella down, suddenly aware of the cabin's rough state. But it's warm, and Rudd won't bother you up here. Stella smiled, catching a snowflake in her palm. It's perfect, Mr. Hale. Thank you. The snow began falling harder as they carried Stella's things inside. Michael built up the fire while she settled Rose in her cradle, humming softly. Lulu lay down between them, watchful and content. Outside, the snowfall thickened, wrapping the cabin in white silence. Michael knew the winter ahead would bring challenges, not just from the weather, but from Rudd and his railroad schemes. By offering Stella shelter, he'd bound their fates together, raised the stakes in ways he couldn't fully grasp. But watching Stella tend to Rose, while Lulu kept guard, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The warmth of a home, not just a cabin. Whatever storms were coming, they would face them together. The pale winter dawn crept through the cabin's frosted windows, painting silver patterns across the rough-hewn floor. Stella stirred on the small cot Michael had set up near the hearth, her blanket pulled tight against the morning chill. The familiar scent of porridge cooking drew her fully awake. Michael stood at the iron stove, stirring a pot with careful attention. His broad shoulders were tense, as if unused to sharing his morning routine. Rose slept peacefully in her cradle while Lulu made her vigilant rounds, moving from window to door to cradle in a protective circuit. "Good morning," Stella said softly, not wanting to startle either man or baby. She smoothed her skirt and quickly pinned up her hair, determined to prove herself useful from the first moment. Michael nodded in greeting, his expression guarded. "Hope porridge suits you. It's what we have most mornings." "It's perfect," Stella assured him, already noting how the smoke from the stove didn't draw properly up the chimney. She'd seen similar problems in her father's house and knew how to fix it. As Michael spooned the porridge into tin bowls, Stella moved around the cabin's main room, taking stock. A draft whistled through a gap near the window, making the curtain flutter. The hearth needed reorganizing to better retain heat, and Rose's cradle sat where both smoke and cold air could reach her. Without asking permission, knowing it might be refused, Stella began her improvements. She found some old rags in her trunk and carefully stuffed them into the window's gap, immediately lessening the draft. Michael watched her work while he ate, his spoon pausing halfway to his mouth. "There's no need to—" he started. "Please," Stella interrupted gently. "Let me help. I know about keeping a home warm." She didn't add that she'd learned these skills caring for Thomas during his final winter, when every draft had threatened his failing lungs. Michael fell silent, but his eyes followed her movements as she rearranged the furniture near the hearth. She shifted the heavy iron pot hooks, adjusted the firewood stack, and placed the metal reflector at a better angle. Almost immediately, the smoke began drawing up properly instead of curling into the room. "How did you know to do that?" Michael asked, genuine curiosity breaking through his reserve. "My father was a carpenter," Stella explained, wiping soot from her hands. "He taught me about how heat and air move through a house." She studied the cabin's layout, then pointed to a corner near the stove. "That would make a perfect warm nook for Rose, away from drafts but close enough to watch." Together, they moved the cradle to the protected corner. Lulu followed, settling herself in her usual spot beside it. The dog's brown eyes tracked their every movement, alert but approving. Rose began to stir, her small face scrunching up as she waked. Before she could work herself into a cry, Stella reached down and lifted her with practiced ease. "Here," she said to Michael, "let me show you something." She demonstrated a gentle rocking motion, supporting Rose's head while keeping her at a slight angle. "The doctor in my hometown said this position helps babies breathe easier. See how her chest isn't working so hard now?" Michael stepped closer, studying the technique. His large, calloused hands mimicked Stella's movements as she transferred Rose to his arms. The baby settled immediately, her breathing noticeably smoother. "Where did you learn about caring for babies?" he asked, wonder softening his voice. Stella's smile held a touch of sadness. "I helped deliver my sister's children. 3 of them now, all healthy." She didn't mention her own dreams of motherhood, cut short by Thomas's illness. As the morning progressed into afternoon, Stella continued making small improvements around the cabin while sharing pieces of her story. She told Michael about her teaching position in Denver, cut short when Thomas fell ill, about their move to the mountains, hoping the air would help his consumption. "He was a surveyor," she explained, carefully sweeping the hearth. "He knew things about the railroad's plans, things Mr. Rudd wanted kept quiet. That's why the deed is so important." She paused, remembering Thomas's urgent whispers in those final days. The railroad's proposed route would cut through sacred native burial grounds. Thomas couldn't bear to be part of that destruction. Michael absorbed this information in silence, but his expression grew darker at the mention of Rudd. He went about his own chores, feeding the horses, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, while Stella worked inside. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other with growing comfort. Rose seemed to thrive under their shared attention. Her breathing episodes grew less frequent, and she smiled more often, especially when Stella sang quiet hymns while working. Lulu remained devoted to her guard duty, but began including Stella in her protective circle, watching the door when Stella stepped outside to hang washing. Though Michael revealed little about himself, Stella noticed how he relaxed slightly as the day wore on. His shoulders lost some of their stiffness, and once she caught him almost smiling when Rose grabbed his finger while he fed her. As evening approached, Stella prepared a simple supper from Michael's stored provisions: beans, salt pork, and cornbread. The familiar tasks of cooking helped settle her nerves about this new arrangement. She'd been so focused on proving her worth, she hadn't fully processed the strangeness of living under a widower's roof. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the crack of firewood and Rose's occasional coos. Stella could feel questions building in Michael, about her plans, about how long she intended to stay, but he kept them to himself. She was grateful for that. The future felt too uncertain to discuss. After the dishes were cleaned and Rose was settled for the night, Stella sat in the chair by the fire, finally allowing herself to rest. To her surprise, Lulu padded over and lay down at her feet, something the dog hadn't done before. The warm weight against her boots felt like acceptance. Michael, loading more wood into the stove, paused at the sight. Something in his face changed, a softening around the eyes, a slight ease in his perpetual frown. He didn't speak, but Stella could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere, as if some invisible wall had begun to crumble. Rose slept peacefully in her new corner, her breathing steady and strong. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of white silence. For the first time since Thomas's death, Stella felt truly warm, truly safe. She understood that nothing was settled. Rudd's threats still loomed. The winter would bring hardships, and grief still haunted both her and Michael. But here, in this moment, with Lulu's solid presence at her feet and Rose's gentle breathing filling the quiet, Stella felt the first stirrings of hope. They were creating something here, this unlikely collection of souls. Not quite a family yet, but perhaps the beginning of one. Dawn broke over the mountain valley, painting the snow-covered landscape in crystalline light. The temperature had plummeted overnight, leaving frost patterns on the cabin's windows and a bitter chill that crept through every crack. Michael stirred first, his breath visible in the cold air as he moved quietly to stoke the dying embers. Stella woke to the sound of wood being added to the stove. She pulled her blanket tighter, watching as Michael moved with practiced efficiency in the dim light. Rose was still sleeping soundly in her new corner, her breathing steady and strong. Lulu lay nearby, her head raised to track Michael's movements. "Might be the coldest morning yet," Michael said softly, not turning around. "Best keep Rose wrapped extra warm today." Stella sat up, swinging her feet onto the cold floor. "I'll see to her while you fetch more wood." She was already learning the rhythm of mountain mornings, the careful dance of tasks needed to keep life running smoothly. Michael nodded, pulling on his heavy coat. "Much obliged," he said, and stepped out into the frozen morning. The sound of his axe soon echoed through the valley, steady, methodical strokes that spoke of years of practice. Stella wrapped herself in her shawl and began her own morning routine, checking on Rose first. The baby stirred at her touch but didn't wake, her cheeks pink and warm despite the room's chill. Lulu padded over to Stella, pressing against her skirts in what had become a familiar greeting. "Good morning to you too," Stella whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. She marveled at how quickly Lulu had accepted her, as if the old trail dog had decided Stella belonged here. The chimney needed attention first. Stella had noticed yesterday that soot buildup was affecting the draft, causing smoke to linger too long in the cabin. She gathered her cleaning supplies and set to work, carefully scraping away the black residue. It was messy work, but she knew clean air was essential for Rose's breathing. Michael returned with an armload of split wood, stamping snow from his boots. He paused in the doorway, watching Stella work at the chimney. "Didn't expect you to tackle that," he said. "The less smoke in here, the better for Rose," Stella replied, wiping soot from her hands. "Besides, I'm not afraid of a little dirt." A ghost of a smile crossed Michael's face. "Reckon not." He stacked the wood neatly by the stove, then began preparing breakfast while Stella finished with the chimney. They fell into an easy pattern as the morning progressed. Stella tended to Rose and continued her cabin improvements while Michael handled the outdoor chores. Lulu moved between them, sometimes following Michael outside, other times staying close to Stella and Rose. The dog's protective instincts seemed to have expanded to include all of them now. Around midday, as weak winter sunlight filtered through the windows, Michael called Stella outside. "Best you learn about banking the fire," he said, gesturing to the stove. "Storm season's coming, and you'll need to know how to keep it burning safe and steady." Stella listened carefully as Michael explained the technique, how to arrange the coals, layer the wood, and adjust the damper for different weather conditions. His hands moved with precise confidence as he demonstrated. "The trick is finding the right balance," he explained. "Too much air, it burns too hot and fast. Too little, it smothers and dies." He glanced at her. "Like most things in mountain living, I reckon." "Speaking of balance," Stella said, seizing the moment, "I'm worried about the schoolhouse. Mr. Rudd's threats aren't just about my deed. He's trying to close the school completely." She wrapped her arms against the cold. "Those children need an education, especially with winter coming." Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Rudd's got most folks scared," he finally said, "but fear ain't always stronger than what's right." He looked at her directly. "You really mean to stay and teach?" "I do," Stella said firmly. "Those children deserve a chance at something better. And I won't let Rudd bully me away from what's right." Michael nodded slowly, respect showing in his eyes. They finished the fire banking lesson in comfortable silence, both aware that something had shifted between them. A deepening of trust, perhaps, or understanding. The afternoon passed in a blur of domestic tasks. Stella prepared a hearty stew while Michael repaired some loose boards on the porch. Rose had a small breathing spell, but Stella's gentle rocking and Lulu's vigilant presence helped ease her through it. By evening, the cabin felt warmer, cleaner, and more like a proper home than it had in months. After supper, with Rose finally settled and Lulu dozing by the stove, Michael and Stella sat in the lamp's gentle glow. The wind had picked up outside, making the cabin creak and whisper. It was the kind of evening that invited quiet conversation. "Winter's the hardest," Michael said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. Not just the cold and isolation, but the memories. He stared into the fire, his face shadowed. "Sarah, my wife, she loved winter evenings like this. Said the snow made everything clean and new." Stella held very still, sensing the rarity of this moment. Michael hardly ever spoke of Sarah. "She was so happy when she found out about Rose," he continued, his voice rough. "Had all these plans for what she'd teach her, how they'd garden together come spring." His hands clenched briefly. "Never occurred to me she wouldn't be here for any of it." "The loss never really leaves," Stella said softly, thinking of Thomas. "But sometimes it makes room for something else alongside it." Michael looked at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "Reckon you'd know about that?" Before Stella could respond, Lulu's head snapped up, her ears forward. A low growl rumbled in her throat as she moved to the door. Michael was on his feet instantly, all openness gone from his face. In the sudden silence, they heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats, muffled by snow. Michael grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Lulu's growl deepened. Stella stood too, instinctively moving closer to Rose's cradle. "Can you see anything?" "No," Michael said tersely, still scanning the night. "But something's out there." The hoofbeats faded away, leaving only the wind's moan and Lulu's continued alertness. Michael remained by the window for several long minutes, but nothing else disturbed the darkness. Finally, he lowered his rifle, though tension still lined his shoulders. "Best bank the fire for the night," he said quietly, but his eyes kept returning to the window. The easy warmth of their earlier conversation had vanished, replaced by an unspoken wariness. Something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere, a reminder, perhaps, that their peaceful routine was more fragile than it seemed. Lulu finally settled back down, but she positioned herself where she could watch both the door and Rose's cradle. Her protective instincts, which had been so relaxed earlier, were now fully alert. Stella understood the feeling. Despite the late hour and the fire's warmth, a chill had crept into her bones that had nothing to do with the winter night. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-dusted valley in soft rose and gold. Michael stood at the cabin door, pulling on his heavy coat while watching the sunrise. The morning air bit sharp and clean, carrying the promise of more snow later. "I won't be gone long," he said, turning to Stella, who stood warming her hands by the stove. "Just need to fetch that flour before the weather turns." Stella nodded, adjusting her shawl. "We'll manage just fine, won't we, Rose?" She smiled at the baby, who lay contentedly in her cradle, tiny fists waving at the shadows dancing on the ceiling from the fire. Lulu padded over to Michael, looking up at him expectantly. He shook his head. "No, girl. You stay here and watch over them." The old dog's tail dropped slightly, but she turned and settled near Rose's cradle, ever vigilant. Michael paused at the door, watching Stella bend over Rose, her gentle hands checking the blankets. Something warm stirred in his chest at the sight, familiar and unsettling all at once. He pushed the feeling aside and stepped out into the crisp morning. The ride into town was peaceful, his horse's hooves crunching through the thin crust of snow. Michael used the quiet time to sort through his thoughts. Having Stella in the cabin had changed things in ways he hadn't expected. The place felt more like a home now, with her quiet competence and careful attention to detail. Even Rose seemed stronger, responding to Stella's patient care. The main street was already busy when he arrived, traders and townspeople hurrying about their morning business. Michael tied his horse outside the general store, nodding to familiar faces as he passed. Inside, he found Mr. Peterson already measuring out the flour he'd ordered. "Morning, Michael," the shopkeeper said, his weathered face creasing in a smile. "Been meaning to ask how you're managing with the widow staying at your place. Folks been talking, you know." Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "Folks ought to mind their own business," he said quietly, but without heat. "She's been good with Rose. That's what matters." Peterson nodded, accepting the gentle rebuff. As he wrapped the flower, voices drifted in from the street. Through the store's front window, Michael saw Reverend Boone speaking with Mrs. Thompson, his expression unusually troubled. "Has anyone seen Mrs. Ellison today?" the Reverend was asking. "I need to speak with her about an urgent matter." Michael finished his transaction and stepped outside, the flower secure under his arm. "Morning, Reverend," he said. "Stella's up at my cabin. Something wrong?" Reverend Boone turned, relief crossing his tired face. "Michael, thank goodness. Would you be willing to bring her to town this afternoon? There's something I need to discuss with her. Something important." There was an edge to the Reverend's voice that Michael had never heard before, something between fear and determination. "I can do that," he said slowly. "We'll come after the midday meal." Back at the cabin, Michael found Stella sitting in the rocking chair, teaching Rose simple hand movements. Pat a cake," she sang, softly, gently clapping the baby's tiny hands together. Rose's face lit up with a toothless smile, and Michael felt that warm tug in his chest again. "Someone's happy this morning," he said, setting down the flower. Stella looked up, her own smile matching Rose's. "She's been so alert today. Watch this." She turned back to the baby. "Where's Rose's nose?" She touched Rose's nose gently, and the baby gurgled, trying to grab her finger. Michael watched them for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Reverend Boone was asking after you in town. Says he needs to speak with you about something urgent. Thought we might ride in after lunch, if you're willing." A shadow of concern crossed Stella's face, but she nodded. "Of course. I hope everything's all right." They ate a simple meal of bread and stew, then bundled Rose warmly against the afternoon chill. The sky had turned pewter gray, heavy with the promise of snow. Michael helped Stella mount up, passing Rose to her once she was settled. Lulu trotted alongside as they made their way down the mountain trail. The church stood quiet and empty when they arrived, but Reverend Boone was waiting in his small office behind the building. His face was drawn with what looked like a long-carried weight. When they entered, he gestured for them to sit, his hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Ellison?" "Stella," he began, then faltered. "I've been carrying something for far too long, something I should have spoken of years ago." He glanced at Michael. "Perhaps you should hear this too." Lulu settled between their chairs, her ears forward, alert to the tension in the room. Rose slept peacefully in Stella's arms, unaware of the gravity settling over them. "It's about your land deed," the Reverend continued, his voice growing stronger. 7 years ago, I witnessed something I've never spoken of. I watched a railroad surveyor, working under Mr. Rudd's direction, deliberately falsify boundary markers. They moved them in the night, shifting the property lines to claim land that wasn't rightfully theirs. His hands clenched in his lap. "Including the parcel your deed covers." Stella's breath caught. Michael sat forward, his jaw tight with anger. "You saw this happen and said nothing?" "I was afraid," Boone admitted, shame heavy in his voice. "The railroad's influence was growing, and I convinced myself it wasn't my place to interfere, that perhaps it was for the greater good of the town's development." He looked directly at Stella, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Can you forgive me?" The office fell silent except for Rose's soft breathing and Lulu's occasional shifting. Stella sat very still, processing the revelation. "So my deed is valid," she said finally. "The land truly belongs to me." "Yes," Boone said firmly, "and I'm prepared to testify to what I saw if needed. I've carried this burden of silence too long." He leaned forward earnestly. "Please, don't give in to Rudd's threats. That land is rightfully yours, and my cowardice has already allowed too much injustice." Michael watched Stella's face, seeing determination replace shock. "Thank you for telling us, Reverend," she said quietly. "Your testimony could make all the difference." They talked a while longer, Boone sharing details about the specific markers that had been moved and the other witnesses who might step forward, if given courage by his example. As they prepared to leave, the Reverend blessed them, his voice stronger now that the truth was finally spoken. Stepping out of the church office, Michael immediately tensed. Across the street, Silas Rudd stood in front of the land office, watching them with cold calculation. His presence felt like a shadow falling across their path. Lulu's hackles rose slightly as she positioned herself between the railroad agent and Stella. Without a word, Michael helped Stella and Rose onto the horse, very aware of Rudd's unwavering stare. They rode out of town under that graying sky, each lost in their own thoughts about what the Reverend's confession meant for their future. The conflict that had been simmering was now boiling to the surface, and there would be no easy way to avoid it. Rose stirred against Stella's chest, making small, fussy sounds until Stella adjusted her blanket. Lulu kept pace beside them, her vigilant gaze scanning the trail ahead. Michael rode slightly behind, watching over all of them, knowing that everything had changed with Boone's revelation. The truth was finally out, but truth alone wouldn't be enough to stop Rudd and the railroad. As they climbed the mountain trail toward home, the first few snowflakes began to fall, soft and silent against the darkening afternoon. The weight of Boone's confession and the sight of Rudd's cold stare followed them up the mountain, a reminder that their peaceful routine at the cabin was about to face its greatest test. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows, unusually bright and warm for the season. Michael paused while stoking the fire, noticing how the sunbeams caught dust motes dancing in the air. The usual winter chill had lifted, replaced by an unexpected mildness that felt like a gift. Stella was already up, heating water for tea and humming softly to Rose, who lay contentedly in her cradle. Lulu sat near the door, her tail thumping hopefully against the floorboards as she watched Michael's movements. "Feels almost like spring out there," Michael said, straightening up from the hearth. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Might be good to get Rose some fresh air, if you're willing. There's a nice spot by the creek that stays sheltered." Stella's face brightened at the suggestion. "That sounds wonderful," she said, testing the air coming through the window with her hand. "It is surprisingly mild today. The fresh air would do Rose good, as long as we keep her bundled." They prepared for the short expedition with careful attention. Stella wrapped Rose in her softest blanket, while Michael gathered a larger quilt to spread on the ground. He also packed a small basket with bread and cheese, though he tried to make it seem casual, as if he hadn't been planning this since first light. The creek lay just beyond the cabin's clearing, down a gentle slope through stands of pine and aspen. Michael led the way, instinctively offering his arm to Stella when they reached a particularly rocky stretch. Lulu trotted ahead, then back, then ahead again, her excitement obvious in every bounce and wag. "She's like a puppy today," Stella observed with a smile, adjusting Rose in her arms. The baby was alert, her eyes wide as she took in the shifting patterns of sunlight through the branches above. "Been cooped up too long," Michael replied, watching Lulu's antics with obvious affection. "She knows good days when they come." They reached the creek bank, where Michael had spotted a level patch of grass earlier in the week. The water sang softly over rocks, and the sun had warmed the ground enough to drive away any lingering frost. Michael shook out the quilt, while Stella chose a spot where Rose would be well protected from any stray breeze. Once they settled, Lulu promptly flopped across Michael's boots, positioning herself so she could keep Rose in constant view while still soaking up the sun. The dog's devotion made Stella smile every time she noticed it. "She's such a guardian," Stella said, stroking Lulu's ear. I've never seen such a protective dog." "Saved Rose's life," Michael said quietly. "That morning before we came to town, if Lulu hadn't alerted me." He trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought. Stella reached over and squeezed his hand briefly. "But she did alert you. And now look at our girl, strong and happy in the sunshine." The words, "our girl," hung in the air between them, unexpected but somehow right. Rose chose that moment to wave her tiny fists, catching a sunbeam, as if trying to hold it. The simple joy of it broke through something in Michael's chest. And he laughed, a real laugh, rich and genuine. The sound surprised him so much he almost stopped, but Stella's answering smile was so warm he couldn't help but continue. It felt rusty, this happiness, but good, like stretching a muscle long unused. "She does love the light," he said, still chuckling. "Just like her." He paused, then finished softly. "Like her mother did. Sarah always wanted the curtains open, even in winter." Instead of the usual sharp pain, the memory brought a gentle ache. Perhaps it was the sun, or Rose's contentment, or Stella's quiet presence. But for the first time, he found he could speak of Sarah without feeling like he was drowning. Rose made a grabbing motion toward him, and he offered his finger. Her tiny grip was surprisingly strong, and she made happy cooing sounds as she held on. "I think she wants to hear more," Stella said gently. "About her mother." Michael was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter's fingers wrapped around his own. "Sarah loved days like this," he said finally. "Said they were God's way of reminding us that winter never lasts forever." He smiled faintly. "She was always finding hope in things." "She sounds wonderful," Stella said softly. "She was." Michael took a deep breath. "For a long time after losing her, I couldn't imagine anything but raising Rose alone. Didn't want to imagine anything else, truth be told." Stella nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Grief changes everything. After James died, I thought my whole future had died with him. The idea of teaching again seemed impossible." "But now?" Michael asked, genuinely curious. A spark lit in Stella's eyes. "Now I can't wait to teach again. The children here need education, and I need to be useful, to help shape young minds." She smiled down at Rose. "Maybe even teach this little one someday." "She'd be lucky to have you as her teacher," Michael said quietly, surprising himself with his sincerity. The moment was broken by Lulu's sudden sharp bark. They all jumped, then laughed as they saw she was alerting them to a squirrel that had ventured too close to their blanket. The squirrel shot up the nearest tree, chattering indignantly, while Lulu looked immensely pleased with herself. Stella's laugh was like music, clear and bright in the winter air. Michael found himself watching her, noticing how the sun brought out auburn highlights in her hair, how her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled. Something warm and unexpected bloomed in his chest. Not betrayal, as he might have feared, but possibility. They stayed by the creek until the shadows began to lengthen, and the air took on a familiar winter bite. Rose had dozed off, one hand still clutching Michael's finger, while Lulu had moved to press against Stella's side, sharing warmth. "We should head back," Michael said reluctantly. "Don't want Rose catching a chill." They packed up with the easy coordination of people growing used to working together. Michael carried the basket and blanket, while Stella cradled Rose, and Lulu fell into step beside them, still maintaining her protective watch. The walk home felt different than the walk out, more comfortable, as if something had shifted in the afternoon sun. They moved in easy silence, broken only by Rose's soft breathing and the crunch of their boots on scattered pine needles. Back in the cabin, they settled into their evening routine. Rose went down easily, tired from her outdoor adventure. Stella moved around the kitchen, tidying dishes from their earlier meal, while Michael built up the fire for the night. As the flames caught and grew, Michael remained by the hearth, staring into the fire. The happiness of the afternoon still echoed in his chest, foreign but welcome. He had forgotten what it felt like to laugh freely, to share simple pleasures, to feel like part of a family again. Family. The word caught him by surprise, but he couldn't deny the truth of it. Somehow, in the space of these few weeks, his quiet cabin had transformed. Where once there had been only grief and duty, now there was warmth, purpose, and, yes, joy. Behind him, he could hear Stella softly humming as she worked, the same lullaby she used to soothe Rose. Lulu's nails clicked on the floorboards as she made her usual evening rounds, checking each window and door before settling near the cradle. These simple sounds, these ordinary moments, had become precious without him noticing. The fire crackled, throwing warm light across the cabin's walls. Michael remained still, watching the flames dance, aware of the profound shift in his heart. For the first time since losing Sarah, he had glimpsed a future different from the lonely path he'd resigned himself to walking. The realization shook him, but not with fear, with hope. Dawn brought another crisp morning, with frost glittering on the cabin windows and smoke rising straight from the chimney into the pale sky. Michael pulled on his heavy coat and headed to the barn, boots crunching on frozen ground. The kindling supply needed replenishing. Winter wasn't done with them yet. Inside the barn, the familiar sense of hay and leather wrapped around him as he set up his chopping block. The repetitive motion of splitting wood usually helped clear his mind, but today his thoughts kept drifting back to yesterday's peaceful afternoon by the creek. It felt like a dream now, that moment of warmth and connection. The barn door creaked, and Michael looked up to see Stella stepping through with Rose bundled against her chest. Sunlight streamed in behind them, creating a golden halo effect that made his breath catch. "Hope you don't mind," Stella said, adjusting Rose's blanket. "The sun's so bright today I thought she could use some fresh air while it lasts." Michael nodded, returning to his task. "Good thinking. Just stay close to the barn where it's sheltered." Stella found a sunny spot near the door, settling on an old crate where she could watch him work while keeping Rose warm. Lulu trotted over from the cabin and lay down at their feet, nose pointed toward the trail leading to their homestead. The morning passed peacefully for a time, marked only by the steady thunk of Michael's axe and Rose's occasional happy gurgles. But then Lulu's head snapped up, ears forward. A low growl rumbled in her chest. Michael set down his axe, instantly alert. In the distance, he could hear approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving fast. "Get behind me," he said quietly to Stella, who was already rising with Rose held close. 3 riders appeared around the bend in the trail. Michael's jaw tightened as he recognized Silas Rudd in the lead, flanked by 2 rough-looking men he didn't know. All 3 carried rifles. They pulled up in front of the barn in a deliberate show of force. Dust settled around their horses' hooves as Silas dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. His men remained mounted, their hands resting too casually near their weapons. "Quite the domestic scene," Silas drawled, his eyes moving from Michael to Stella and back again. "Though I'm afraid you're harboring a trespasser, Hale." Michael stepped forward, positioning himself more firmly between Silas and his family. The word came naturally now. Family, even as he fought to keep his voice steady. "Stella's my guest. She's welcome here." "Is she now?" Silas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's not how the railroad sees it. That deed she's clinging to isn't worth the paper it's written on. She has no legal right to be anywhere in this territory." "That's a lie," Stella said firmly from behind Michael. "My husband's deed is valid and registered. You know that, Mr. Rudd." Silas's face darkened. "Your dead husband should have taken the railroad's offer when he had the chance. Now you're just making trouble where there doesn't need to be any." His gaze shifted to Lulu, who stood rigid with hackles raised. "Speaking of trouble, that dog of yours has been marked as dangerous. Town council's received complaints." "Lulu stays with us," Michael said, his voice hard. "She's protected my daughter. She's no threat to anyone who means no harm." "Is that so?" Silas took a step closer, and Lulu's growl deepened. "Seems mighty threatening to me. Be a shame if something had to be done about her. Winter's a dangerous time out here. Accidents happen all too easily." The threat hung in the cold air. Behind Michael, Rose made a small, distressed sound, picking up on the tension. He could hear Stella softly shushing her. Silas's eyes moved to the cabin, then the barn, taking in every detail. His men did the same, their expressions calculating. "Lot of things can go wrong in winter," he continued smoothly. "Fires, fallen trees, spoked horses. Smart folks know when to cut their losses and move on." Michael's hands clenched into fists. "We're not going anywhere, and if anything happens to my family, any accidents, I'll know exactly who's responsible." "That sounds like a threat, Mr. Hale." Silas's smile turned cruel. "I'd be careful about making threats. Never know when they might come back to haunt you." He turned back to his horse, mounting with deliberate slowness. "Think about what I said, about cutting losses. Some things aren't worth dying for." With that, he wheeled his horse around. His men followed, but not before taking one last long look at the homestead. The thunder of hooves faded gradually into the winter morning. Michael waited until they were well out of sight before turning to Stella. She was pale but steady, still holding Rose close. "Are you all right?" She nodded. "I'm sorry, Michael. I never meant to bring this trouble to your door." "This isn't your fault," he said firmly. "Silas Rudd's been trying to drive people off their land for years. He's just never been quite this bold about it before." He looked toward the trail again, jaw set. "Let's get inside. I need to check the cabin's weak points." They spent the rest of the morning and afternoon securing the homestead. Michael reinforced both doors with extra boards, checked every window latch, and moved anything that could be used as a weapon safely inside. He laid in extra supplies of water and food near the hearth, just in case. Stella helped where she could while tending to Rose, who seemed unsettled by the morning's confrontation. The baby fussed more than usual, only calming when Stella sang softly to her. Lulu moved restlessly between them all, as if trying to keep everyone in sight at once. As Michael worked, his anger grew. The casual way Silas had threatened them, the calculated looks from his men, they weren't just trying to scare them off. They were planning something. The question was what, and when. The short winter day faded quickly into dusk. They ate a quiet supper, both lost in thought. After helping clean up, Michael made one final check of the cabin's defenses before banking the fire for the night. But sleep proved elusive. He lay on his bedroll, listening to the winter wind and the soft sounds of Rose and Stella breathing. Lulu had positioned herself between the door and the cradle, her vigilance matching his own. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whistle of wind through the trees outside set his nerves on edge. Silas's threats echoed in his mind. Accidents happen in winter. The railroad agent wasn't known for idle threats. Whatever was coming, Michael knew it would come soon. He stared into the darkness, one hand resting on his rifle, unable to shake the feeling that danger was drawing closer with every passing hour. The night pressed heavy around the cabin, full of shadows and possibilities. while inside, his newfound family slept uneasily under his watch. A bitter wind howled outside the cabin, rattling the shutters and whistling through the smallest gaps in the logs. Inside, Michael and Stella sat at the rough-hewn table, their bowls of stew growing cold as they picked at their food in silence. The day's confrontation with Silas hung heavy in the air between them. Rose fussed in her cradle, perhaps sensing the tension. Stella rose to comfort her, speaking soft words that were nearly lost in the wind's moan. Lulu paced restlessly from window to door and back again, her claws clicking against the wooden floor. Every few minutes, she would stop and cock her head, as if listening for something beyond the cabin walls. "She's been like this for hours," Stella observed, settling Rose back into her cradle. "I've never seen her so unsettled." Michael watched the old dog's movements, his own unease growing. "She knows something's wrong. Animals can sense trouble coming." They finished their meal in silence, the wind's voice growing louder as darkness settled fully over the mountain. Before preparing for bed, Michael made his usual rounds of the cabin. He checked the doors, reinforcements, tested the window latches, and finally turned his attention to the hearth. Standing on a chair, he reached up to check the chimney flue. The metal damper felt solid under his fingers, moving smoothly as he tested it. The brick surrounding it seemed secure. Satisfied, he stepped down and began banking the fire for the night. "Everything look all right?" Stella asked, arranging her blankets on the small cot. Michael nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at him. "Far as I can tell. But keep your boots close tonight, just in case." They settled into their now familiar positions for sleep. Stella on the cot along the wall, Michael on his bedroll near the hearth, Rose in her cradle between them. Lulu took up her usual guard position beside Rose, but her eyes remained fixed on the door, ears twitching at every sound. The wind continued its assault on the cabin, making sleep elusive. Michael lay awake, listening to the creak of timber and the soft breathing of his makeshift family. His mind kept returning to Silas's threats, trying to guess what form the railroad agent's revenge might take. The fire burned lower, its light dimming as the hours crept past midnight. The cabin grew colder as the embers faded. Finally, exhaustion began to pull at Michael's eyelids, drawing him down into an uneasy sleep. He didn't know how much time had passed when Lulu's whine cut through his dreams. Her warm weight pressed against his side as she scratched frantically at his arm. Michael tried to push her away, still half asleep, but the dog's urgency only increased. That's when he smelled it. Smoke, thicker than it should be. His eyes snapped open to a hazy gray cloud gathering near the ceiling. "Stella!" he called sharply, already on his feet. "Wake up!" Rose's weak coughing galvanized him into action. He rushed to the hearth, where smoke was pouring from around the chimney's edges instead of rising up it. The fire had nearly died, but the smoke had nowhere to go. Michael grabbed the poker and reached up, probing the flue. The damper wouldn't move. Something was blocking it completely. "What's happening?" Stella asked, voice tight with fear as she lifted Rose from the cradle. The baby's coughs were growing more distressed. "Someone's blocked the chimney from outside," Michael growled, fury mixing with fear. "Silas, has to be." He threw open the cabin door, letting in a blast of frigid air. "Get Rose outside, now!" Stella didn't hesitate. She wrapped Rose tightly in blankets and hurried out into the darkness. Lulu followed close at her heels while Michael opened every window, creating a cross breeze to clear the smoke. The bitter mountain night cut through their night clothes like knives. Michael pulled Stella and Rose close, trying to shield them from the wind as they watched smoke drift out the cabin's open door. Rose's coughing gradually eased in the clean air, but her breathing remained shallow and labored. "She needs to get warm," Stella said, her teeth chattering. "But we can't take her back inside until the smoke clears." Michael nodded grimly. "The barn. We'll bed down there tonight." He turned to look at their cabin, barely visible in the starlight. "First light, I'm checking that chimney. Need to see exactly what they did." They made their way carefully to the barn, where the livestock's body heat had created a pocket of warmer air. Michael quickly arranged clean straw and horse blankets in an empty stall, creating a makeshift bed. Stella settled there with Rose while he lit a small lantern. The barn's familiar smells, hay, horses, leather, surrounded them as they huddled together for warmth. Lulu pressed close against Stella's side, her body heat helping to warm Rose. The baby's breathing gradually steadied, though occasionally a small cough would still escape her. Michael sat with his back against the stall wall, every muscle tense as he listened for sounds of movement outside. His mind kept replaying Silas's threats from that morning. The railroad agent had meant every word. He was willing to do anything to drive them away, even if it meant... He looked down at Rose, so small and vulnerable in Stella's arms. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Silas would kill a baby to get what he wanted, would have killed her tonight, if not for Lulu's warning. The thought made his hands shake with rage and horror. "Michael!" Stella's voice was soft in the darkness. "What are we going to do?" He reached out and touched Rose's cheek, feeling her warm breath against his fingers. "Whatever we have to," he said finally. "But this ends now. Silas has gone too far." The night crawled by with agonizing slowness. None of them slept much, starting at every sound carried on the wind. Lulu remained alert, head raising at the smallest disturbance, but no further threats materialized. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, Michael finally allowed himself to acknowledge the full weight of what had nearly happened. He had almost lost Rose, lost everything, because he hadn't been prepared for just how far Silas would go. The thought settled in his chest, like a block of ice. Rose stirred in Stella's arms, making small sounds of discomfort. Her breathing still carried a slight wheeze that made Michael's heart clench. They needed to get her warm, needed to make the cabin safe again, needed to stop Silas before he could try something worse. But in that cold hour before dawn, watching his daughter struggle for breath, Michael had never felt more helpless, or more determined to make things right. The wind continued its mournful song outside the barn, a reminder of just how exposed and vulnerable they were. But as Michael watched Stella soothing Rose, saw Lulu's unwavering vigilance, he knew they would face whatever came next together. They had to. Their lives depended on it. Dawn crept over the mountains with hesitant fingers, painting the snow-dusted valley in shades of gray. Michael stood in the barn doorway, watching the first weak light touch the cabin's smoke-stained walls. His eyes burned from lack of sleep, and every muscle ached from the tension of their night in the barn. "Think it's safe to go back in?" Stella asked softly, Rose still bundled against her chest. Michael nodded slowly. "Smoke should have cleared by now, but let me check first, just to be certain." He crossed the frozen ground to the cabin, boots crunching on frost-covered grass. The morning air bit through his coat, reminding him how desperately they needed warmth. Opening the door carefully, he found the interior still carried the acrid scent of smoke, but the haze had dissipated through the open windows. "It's all right," he called back to Stella, "but keep Rose wrapped up until we get a proper fire going." Lulu trotted ahead of Stella, nose working as she investigated every corner of the cabin. Her tail remained low, ears alert for any sign of danger. Michael watched the old dog's methodical inspection, knowing her instincts had saved them all the night before. Inside, the damage was immediately visible. Soot had settled over everything like black snow: the table, the chairs, the bedding. The hearthstones were cold, with only scattered ashes remaining from last night's fire. Above, the chimney loomed dark and threatening, a reminder of how close they'd come to disaster. "We'll need to clean everything," Stella said, looking around with weary determination. "The soot's not good for Rose's breathing." Michael dragged a chair beneath the chimney opening. "First things first. Need to see what they did to the flue." Standing on the chair, he reached up into the chimney with careful fingers. The metal damper had been wedged shut with what felt like pieces of broken branches, jammed in from above. Someone, Silas's men, surely, had climbed onto the roof in the night to do their sabotage. Working slowly, Michael managed to clear enough of the debris to restore proper airflow. "It's temporary," he admitted, climbing down. "We'll need proper repairs, but this should let us have a fire for now." Stella had settled in the rocking chair, still holding Rose close. The baby's face was pale, and her breathing carried a slight wheeze that made Michael's chest tighten with worry. He quickly set about building a new fire, choosing the driest wood to minimize smoke. As warmth gradually returned to the cabin, they began assessing their situation. Michael wiped soot from the table while Stella gently rocked Rose, who had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. "We can't stay here," Michael said finally, breaking their tense silence. "Not with Rose. It's too dangerous." Stella's fingers tightened slightly on the blanket wrapped around Rose. "If we leave, Silas wins. That land, my husband's land, it's all I have left. And it's not just about me anymore. How many other families has the railroad cheated? How many more will they hurt if nobody stands up to them?" Lulu whined softly, pressing closer to the rocking chair. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the newly secured windows. Michael ran a hand through his hair, leaving a streak of soot across his forehead. "I know," he said. "But Rose..." He couldn't finish the thought, the memory of her desperate coughing still too fresh. Before Stella could respond, they heard hoofbeats approaching. Michael moved quickly to the window, hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. But the figure emerging from the morning mist was familiar. Reverend Boone, hunched against the cold on his old bay mare. The preacher dismounted stiffly, his face grave as he took in the smoke-stained cabin. "I saw tracks leading this way last night," he said without preamble. "Fresh ones, when nobody should have been out in that weather. I feared..." He trailed off, looking at Rose's sleeping form. "Come in, Reverend," Michael said, opening the door. "Though I should warn you, everything's covered in soot." Once inside, Boone listened intently as they described the night's events. His weathered face grew increasingly troubled, hands clasped tightly in his lap. "This cannot continue," he said finally, voice heavy with resolve. "I've carried my silence too long, watched too many good people driven from their rightful land." He turned to Stella. "You still have your deed?" She nodded. "Locked in my trunk. But Silas claims it's worthless." "It's not worthless," Boone said firmly. "And I can prove it. The territorial judge is in Summit City today. He comes through once a month to hear cases. We need to bring this to him now, before Silas can file his falsified documents claiming the land is abandoned." Michael exchanged a quick look with Stella. "Today? In this weather?" "It has to be today," Boone insisted, leaning forward earnestly. "I've seen how Silas works. He'll have men watching the judge's office, waiting to file the moment it opens. Once those papers are recorded, it becomes much harder to fight." Outside, snow began falling again. Fat, heavy flakes that promised more accumulation. Michael stood and walked to the window, considering their options. The trip to Summit City would be difficult, especially with Rose, but staying here meant remaining vulnerable to whatever Silas planned next. "How long to reach Summit City?" he asked, turning back to Boone. 4 hours in good weather. Longer in this snow. But if we leave now, we can make it before the courthouse closes. Stella stood carefully, still holding Rose. "I'll get my deed and pack some supplies for Rose." Her voice was steady, determined. "We've got no choice. We have to try." Michael nodded, already mentally preparing for the journey. "I'll saddle the horse and rig up the best shelter I can for Rose." He looked at Boone. "You'll ride with us? Testify about what you saw?" "Every word," Boone promised. "It's long past time I made this right." They moved quickly after that, gathering only what they absolutely needed. Michael worked outside, saddling his strongest horse and rigging a makeshift shelter using canvas and spare blankets. Inside, Stella packed Rose's necessities and retrieved her deed, while Boone helped clean the worst of the soot from their travel clothes. Lulu paced between them all, her attention never straying far from Rose. When Michael came back inside, the old dog pressed against his legs, clearly anxious about the coming journey. "You'll have to keep up, girl," he told her softly, scratching behind her ears. "We need you with us." Finally, they were ready. Michael helped Stella mount, then carefully handed Rose up to her, making sure the baby was secure in her warmth. The snow was falling steadily now, adding an extra layer of urgency to their departure. Boone mounted his own horse, adjusting his coat against the weather. "We'll need to pace ourselves," he advised. "No good arriving if the horse is too spent to make it." Michael swung into the saddle behind Stella, one arm steadying her and Rose, while the other held the reins. Lulu stood ready, tail high despite the cold, waiting for their signal to move out. The snow swirled around them as they set off down the trail, their breath frosting in the morning air. Behind them, smoke still rose from the cabin's chimney, a thin, straight line now that the flue was cleared. Michael couldn't help glancing back, wondering if they would return to find it standing or in ashes. But as Rose stirred against Stella's chest, making a small sound of discomfort, he knew they'd made the only choice they could. Whatever happened to the cabin, protecting his daughter, and the woman who had somehow become essential to both their lives, mattered more than any building. The snow continued falling as they made their way down the mountain, Boone leading on his bay mare, Lulu trotting faithfully alongside. Each step took them closer to confrontation, closer to justice, closer to whatever future lay waiting in Summit City. Michael felt Stella lean back slightly against him, sharing warmth as the cold wind picked up. Rose slept on, bundled safely between them. Together they rode toward whatever justice they could find, while behind them, the morning light painted the snow-covered valley in shades of promise and uncertainty. The snow fell in thick curtains as they made their way down the mountain trail. Lulu moved steadily ahead, her nose close to the ground, picking out the safest path through the deepening white. Her dark fur collected snowflakes as she worked, making her look almost silver in the dim light. Michael kept Rose tucked inside his heavy coat, feeling her small warmth against his chest. Every few minutes, he would peek down to check her breathing, relief washing through him each time he saw her peaceful face. Stella sat behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, occasionally reaching forward to touch Rose's blanket-wrapped feet. The horse moved carefully, hooves breaking through the crusty surface of older snow beneath the fresh powder. Wind whistled through the pines, carrying more snow that stung their faces and made visibility poor. Reverend Boone had fallen slightly behind, his older mare struggling with the conditions. "There's a stream crossing ahead," Michael called over his shoulder to Stella, raising his voice above the wind. "We should stop there, check on Rose. When they reached the stream, its banks were thick with ice, though the water still moved darkly beneath. Michael dismounted first, helping Stella down before carefully extracting Rose from his coat. They huddled beneath a large pine where the snow was thinner, adjusting blankets and warming Rose's tiny hands between their own. Lulu shook herself vigorously, sending snow flying, then pressed close to Rose and Stella as they worked. The old dog's body provided welcome warmth as they waited for Boone to catch up. The Reverend arrived a few minutes later, breathing hard and looking worried. "Sorry," he wheezed, sliding stiffly from his saddle. "Old Martha isn't as sure-footed as she used to be." "We needed the rest anyway," Stella assured him, tucking an extra blanket around Rose. The baby stirred, making small sounds of protest at being disturbed, but settled quickly back to sleep. They didn't linger long. The cold was too bitter, and time pressed heavily on them all. Soon they were moving again, Lulu leading them back to the main trail. The snow continued steadily, but the wind gradually died down as they descended, making travel slightly easier. By early afternoon, the buildings of Summit City emerged from the swirling white. Unlike their small settlement, this was a proper town with a courthouse, hotel, and rows of businesses lining the streets. They rode straight to the courthouse, a 2-story brick building with snow collecting on its wide steps. Michael helped Stella dismount, then carefully handed Rose down to her. Boone tied their horses at the hitching rail while Lulu shook off the snow and pressed close to Stella's skirts, clearly unwilling to be separated from Rose. Inside, the courthouse halls were warm and surprisingly busy. A clerk directed them to the judge's chamber on the 2nd floor, warning them that several cases were already waiting. As they climbed the stairs, voices drifted down, one particularly familiar and unwelcome. "The land is clearly abandoned," Silas Rudd's smooth voice carried through the partially open door. "I have documentation here showing—" Michael's jaw tightened. Stella clutched Rose closer, her face pale but determined. Boone straightened his snow-dampened coat and led the way into the chamber. The room fell silent as they entered. Silas stood before the judge's desk, papers spread across its surface. His confident expression flickered briefly when he saw them, then reformed into a cold smile. "Your Honor," Boone spoke first, stepping forward, "we need to request an emergency. Hearing regarding these very lands Mr. Rudd is discussing." The judge, a stern-faced man with gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from the documents with a frown. "This is highly irregular. Mr. Rudd has presented clear evidence that the land in question is abandoned and subject to reclamation under territorial law." "That evidence is false," Stella said firmly, though her voice shook slightly. "I have the original deed here, and Reverend Boone can testify to the railroad's previous attempts to steal this land through fraudulent surveys." Silas's smile vanished. "These are serious accusations, Your Honor. Perhaps we should clear the chamber and discuss this privately." "No." Michael stepped forward, keeping his voice steady despite his anger. "This needs to be heard properly, with witnesses. These documents Mr. Rudd is trying to file. They're part of a pattern of threats and violence that nearly cost my daughter her life last night." The judge studied them all carefully, noting Rose in Stella's arms, Boone's earnest face, and the protective way Lulu positioned herself between them and Silas. Finally, he gathered the papers on his desk into a neat stack. "Very well," he said. "I'll hear all parties in 1 hour. Mr. Rudd, you'll remain to present your evidence. Mrs. Ellison, you'll present your deed and witnesses. Until then, clear the chamber so I may review what's before me." They filed into the hallway, tension crackling between them. Silas brushed past, his shoulder deliberately knocking against Michael's. "Enjoy your last hour of hope," he muttered, then strode away down the corridor. Michael, Stella, and Boone found a quiet corner near a window. Snow continued falling outside as they huddled together, reviewing the deed and discussing Boone's testimony. Rose slept peacefully, unaware that her future, all their futures, would be decided within the hour. Lulu settled at their feet, her watchful eyes never leaving the hallway where Silas had disappeared. The old dog's loyalty and vigilance remained unchanged, whether guarding against threats in the night or in a courthouse corridor. The next hour would determine everything: their homes, their safety, and the justice they'd fought so hard to reach through the snow. The hour crept by like molasses in winter. Michael paced the courthouse hallway, while Stella studied her deed one final time. Reverend Boone sat with his head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer. Lulu remained alert, her brown eyes tracking every movement. When the clerk finally called them in, Michael gathered Rose gently from Stella's arms. The baby stirred but stayed quiet, bundled warmly against his chest. Lulu padded after them, her nails clicking softly on the wooden floor. The judge's chamber felt smaller now, crowded with tension. "Mrs. Ellison," the judge said, "present your case." Stella stepped forward, unfolding her deed with steady hands. "This land was legally purchased and recorded," she explained, her voice clear and strong. "My late husband's signature and the territorial seal are both present." The judge examined the document carefully while Silas shifted impatiently. When his turn came, he spread his own papers across the desk with flourish. "These records show the land was abandoned," Silas declared. "Mrs. Ellison is squatting illegally, and Mr. Hale is harboring her in defiance of railroad interests." His voice dripped with false authority. "If I may, Your Honor." Reverend Boone rose slowly from his chair, his hands trembling. The room grew still as the old preacher stepped forward. "I must speak of a sin I've carried too long." Silas's face tightened. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant." "Let him speak," the judge commanded. 7 years ago, Boone continued, his voice gathering strength, "I witnessed railroad surveyors falsifying boundary markers on that very parcel. They moved the stakes at night, redrew maps to steal land they had no right to claim. I stayed silent, fearing retaliation." He bowed his head. "My cowardice has haunted me since." The chamber fell so quiet they could hear Rose's soft breathing. Lulu pressed against Michael's legs, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Lies!" Silas burst out, his composed mask cracking. "He's a doddering old fool." "That's enough," the judge cut in sharply. "Reverend Boone, are you willing to provide sworn testimony to these events?" "I am, Your Honor, before God and this court." The judge turned to Silas, who had gone pale beneath his bluster. "Very well. Mr. Rudd, produce your witnesses to counter this testimony." Silas glanced at the door, then back at the judge. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. No witnesses appeared. The judge leafed through the papers, comparing dates and signatures with practiced eyes. His weathered fingers traced the lines of Stella's deed, then moved to examine Silas's documents more closely. "These irregularities are troubling," he announced, tapping Silas's papers. "Multiple dates have been altered, and these signatures don't match our county records." He looked up, his expression stern. "Furthermore, Reverend Boone's testimony of witnessed fraud aligns with several other complaints we've received about railroad operations in this territory." The judge straightened in his chair. "I hereby declare Mrs. Ellison's deed valid and legally binding." He turned toward Silas, who had gone rigid. "As for you, Mr. Rudd, you'll be placed under arrest for fraud, and given the report of last night's sabotage at the Hale homestead, those charges will be added as well." Something snapped in Silas's face. With shocking speed, he yanked a knife from his boot. "That mongrel ruined everything," he snarled, lunging toward Lulu with the blade glinting. The old dog didn't hesitate. She sprang forward, positioning herself between Silas and baby Rose, her teeth bared in a fierce growl. Michael reacted instantly, driving his shoulder into Silas's midsection. Both men crashed to the floor, the knife skittering away under the judge's desk. "Help!" Rose's frightened wail filled the chamber as Michael and Silas grappled. Stella rushed forward, scooping the baby close and backing away from the struggle. Lulu maintained her protective stance, trembling but determined, her eyes never leaving the fight. The scuffle ended quickly as two deputies burst through the door. They grabbed Silas's arms, wrenching them behind his back as Michael rolled away, breathing hard. The sound of iron shackles clicking shut echoed in the sudden quiet. "Get him out of here," the judge ordered, his voice hard with disgust. The deputies hauled Silas to his feet. His face was twisted with rage as they dragged him toward the door. "You'll regret this," he spat, but his threat sounded hollow now. Michael stood slowly, checking himself for injuries. Stella hurried to his side, Rose hiccuping against her shoulder. Lulu pressed against their legs, still quivering but standing tall. Together they watched as Silas was marched away in chains, his footsteps fading down the courthouse hall. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows as the judge handed Stella her officially stamped deed. Her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the document, its crisp edges and official seal representing more than just ownership. It meant safety, purpose, and a future. "The town council met early this morning," Judge Harrison said, smiling. "They voted unanimously to offer you the permanent teaching position at our schoolhouse." Stella pressed the deed to her heart, overcome. Michael stood nearby, Rose bundled in his arms, and Lulu alert at his feet. Together they stepped out into the bright morning air. Townspeople approached with warm greetings and congratulations. Even Mrs. Peterson, who'd been skeptical of newcomers, pressed Stella's hand and welcomed her properly to the community. Reverend Boone crossed the street toward them, his eyes glistening. "The truth has set me free," he said softly, clasping Stella's hands. "I've carried that burden far too long." Lulu nuzzled his palm, forgiving and gentle. They rode home that afternoon, the winter air crisp but not bitter. Michael immediately set to work on the chimney, determined to make it stronger than before. Inside, Stella rearranged the small bedroom, creating a protected corner for Rose's cradle, where no drafts could reach. She hung thick quilts on the walls and laid soft rugs on the floor, transforming the space into a proper nursery. Lulu, exhausted from days of vigilance, settled near Rose's cradle. Her proud stance showed she understood her role in their victory, though her eyes grew heavy with well-earned rest. As evening approached, Michael finished the chimney repairs and came inside, washing soot from his hands. He watched Stella warming milk for Rose, moving through his cabin as if she'd always belonged there. The lamplight caught her hair, and something in his heart shifted firmly into place. "Stella," he said quietly. She turned, reading the emotion in his face. "Would you stay? Not as a guest, but—" He took a breath. "As part of our family, all of us together." Tears welled in Stella's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." They sat down to supper, the cabin warm and secure around them. Rose dozed peacefully in her cradle, while Lulu stretched out contentedly at their feet. Michael reached across the table and took Stella's hand, their fingers intertwining as naturally as breathing. No words were needed. They were already home. Spring swept through the valley like a gentle hand, melting winter's memories and painting the mountainsides in soft greens. The morning air carried the sweet scent of wild roses and fresh-turned earth as Michael stood at the edge of their expanded homestead, marveling at how much had changed in just a few weeks. Behind the cabin, neat rows of freshly planted vegetables stretched toward the tree line, where his land now merged seamlessly with Stella's adjoining plot. She had insisted on starting the garden early, knowing exactly which corners caught the best morning light. Young pea shoots already pushed through the dark soil, reaching for the sun like tiny, hopeful fingers. Lulu trotted along the garden's edge, nose twitching at fresh rabbit trails but staying dutifully within bounds. She'd grown more relaxed these days, as if sensing the permanent peace that had settled over their home. Her patrol of the property now felt more like a happy routine than a necessary vigilance. Inside the cabin, Stella hummed softly while dressing Rose in a tiny white gown she'd sewn herself. The baby's breathing had grown stronger with the warmer weather, her laughs fuller and more frequent. Through the open window, Michael caught snippets of Stella's tender whispers to their daughter, and his heart swelled. The sound of wagon wheels brought his attention to the path, where Reverend Boone approached in his Sunday best, Bible tucked carefully under one arm. The older man's face glowed with genuine joy as he climbed down, patting Lulu's head when she came to greet him. "Perfect day for a wedding," Boone said, gesturing to the sunlight filtering through the pines. Michael nodded, too full of emotion for words. They gathered beneath the tallest pines, where morning sun danced through the branches. Michael stood straight and tall, his best shirt freshly pressed, watching as Stella emerged from the cabin. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair crowned with white wildflowers. In her arms, Rose cooed and reached for the shifting patterns of light and shadow. Lulu positioned herself at their feet, her tail sweeping the pine needles in slow, contented arcs. Her presence completed their circle, guardian and family member all in one. Reverend Boone spoke of love's healing power, of God's grace in bringing broken pieces together to form something stronger and more beautiful. Michael and Stella exchanged rings and simple, heartfelt vows, their words carrying on the spring breeze like a promise. After pronouncing them husband and wife, Boone stepped back, smiling through tears. Michael turned to Stella, gently lifting Rose from her arms. With overwhelming joy, he raised their daughter toward the sky just as a shaft of sunlight broke through the pine boughs, bathing the baby in golden light. Rose squealed in delight, her tiny hands reaching for the brightness. Stella's laughter rang out, pure and free, as she reached for both of them. Michael brought Rose down into their embrace, forming a tight circle of arms and hearts and hope. Lulu barked joyfully, unable to contain her excitement. She bounded around them in celebration, her paws kicking up pine needles that sparkled in the morning light. Her circle grew tighter and tighter until she pressed against their legs, wanting to be part of their embrace. Michael knelt down, keeping one arm around Stella and Rose, while his other hand found Lulu's favorite spot behind her ears. The old dog leaned into his touch, her brown eyes wise and content. "You didn't just save her, girl," Michael whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved all of us." Lulu's tail thumped against the forest floor as she looked up at her family. The man who had always been hers, the woman who had earned her trust, and the baby she had protected from the very beginning. Together they stood in the dappled sunlight, whole and healed and home at last. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.